Welcome, cherished, chosen ones. The most heinous acts are not perpetrated in obscurity. They unfold beneath the sun by individuals who beam as they execute them. There is something deeply unsettling about the manner in which they wronged you. Not discreetly, not with restraint, but boisterously, intentionally, and brazenly, as though assaulting a blameless soul earned them a thunderous ovation in the pits of darkness. Let us establish one undeniable reality. Research in behavioral science demonstrates that individuals are 4 times more inclined to trust a magnetic deceiver than a humble truth speaker. And who were you? The humble truth speaker. The soul who showed up, did what was honorable, loved fiercely, gave generously, and still ended up crucified as the antagonist in their warped fairy tale. And the cruelest element of all, they were fully cognizant of your purity. They recognized your sincerity. They simply did not care, because the narrative felt far more tantalizing when you were cast as the offender. People adore proclaiming that honesty always emerges victorious eventually, as though it were a soothing lullaby. Yet honesty, the genuine variety, typically arrives fashionably tardy, enraged, clutching receipts, and prepared to demolish group threads. So here we stand at this moment, the very same souls who cackled while you wept, who choreographed your public dismantling like a community spectacle. They are now stammering, perspiring, and frantically manufacturing alibis because the world is beginning to recognize that you were the blameless one. And what they unleashed upon you was absolutely revolting. Let us examine it. Let us peel away the facade, reverse the narrative, and finally articulate what should have been voiced from the very beginning. And if tender ears cannot withstand unvarnished reality, this video may not suit your disposition. Yet if you are prepared to witness celestial vindication in its full glory, brace yourself. Point 1. They corrupted your innocence because it illuminated their corruption. They did not despise you because you erred. They despised you because you were right. You possessed no requirement for disguises or pretense. You entered spaces with your head elevated, a clear conscience and an untouched spirit. That is what unsettled them. You owed no one explanations for conducting yourself with decency, yet somehow your virtue became a spotlight exposing their decay. The manner in which you engaged others with justice, integrity, and tenderness made them uneasy. Not because you were excessive, but because they were insufficient. It was never about outshining anyone. In truth, you likely yearned for tranquility, yet your mere presence revealed what they had forfeited long ago. Authenticity. They bartered their honesty for ovations, peddled their principles for fame, and molded their existence around deceit and facades. Then you appeared. No theatrics, no tricks, simply genuine, and that proved overwhelming. You functioned as a reflection they never requested. And rather than acknowledging what they observed, they attempted to shatter the reflection and condemn it for exposing the fractures. They yearned to label you as counterfeit. They needed to convince themselves you were concealing something. Because if a soul could endure what you have endured and still emanate radiance, then what justification remained for their transformation into monsters in the name of survival? You embodied the unspoken evidence that the spirit can remain pristine even after the tempest. And that drove them to madness. They craved your collapse. They petitioned for your ruin beneath fabricated grins. And when it failed to materialize, they attempted to engineer one. That is what renders it so perverse. You were not even competing, you were simply existing. Yet in a society dominated by those who prosper through power, silence, and authority, your blamelessness generated excessive disruption. It destabilized the illusions upon which they constructed their lives, so they had to designate you as the adversary. Not because you were wicked, but because you compelled them to confront the wickedness within themselves. They did not merely assault an individual. They assaulted the evidence that even within this shadowy realm virtue endures, and they could not tolerate it. Point 2. They resorted to character assassination because substantive evidence did not exist. They could unearth no genuine dirt upon you, so they had to fabricate some. That is how desperate the situation had become. When they recognized there was no proof, no scandal, no smoking gun, they did not retreat. They doubled down because honesty was not serving their agenda. So they constructed a falsehood, capable of inflicting the damage that facts never could, and they rendered it convincing. They adorned it with manufactured concern, manipulated the chronology, omitted critical details, and sprinkled in just enough reality to render it plausible. That is the mechanics of character assassination. It requires no evidence. It merely requires volume and repetition. They did not desire independent thought from the public. They desired emotional reactions, fury, suspicion, distrust, anything that would transform the masses against you. So they planted seeds within conversations, whispered your identity into controversy, and posed fabricated questions like, "Does it not seem peculiar how they always, fully aware of their machinations?" They could not confront you directly because you had committed no transgression, and that is what frustrated them most profoundly. You possessed nothing to conceal. So rather than exposing a secret, they had to fabricate a story. What compounds the offense is how swiftly people embraced it, not because it was logical, but because falsehoods propagate more rapidly than truth, particularly when the truth is mundane and the lie is sensational. You became a subject, a whisper, a punchline, and the individuals who once beamed in your presence began casting sideways glances, not because they possessed any certainty, but because someone wielding sufficient influence whispered the wrong sentiment at the opportune moment. It was never about veracity, it was about dominion. They sought to dictate how people perceived you, how you were received, how your identity carried significance or forfeited it. And the swiftest method to accomplish that was not through candor. It was through manipulation. The sorrowful element is that most people did not care whether it was factual. They simply craved involvement in the spectacle. Yet here is the crucial reality. Truth does not panic. It does not shriek for attention. It waits. And now that the falsehoods are beginning to disintegrate, they are recognizing they did not merely lie about you. They exposed themselves. Point 3. You became the repository for their internal decay. They exploited you as a dumping ground, not because you warranted it, but because you represented the safest location for their venom. You transformed into the emotional waste receptacle for individuals who refused to assume accountability for their own fractured states. Everything they preferred not to confront, their guilt, shame, fury, envy, self-loathing, they poured onto you as though it were your obligation to bear it. They were suffering, yet rather than pursuing healing, they projected. Rather than performing the labor, they deposited it all upon you and labeled you overly sensitive when it overwhelmed you. You were not their affliction. You were simply available. You were the one who listened, the one who cared, the one who materialized when they required someone to lean upon. Yet when they required someone to condemn, you remained present. So, they designated you as the target. It was convenient. You became the scapegoat for circumstances entirely unrelated to you. If they experienced insecurity, they attributed it to your confidence. If they experienced guilt, they branded you as judgmental. If they harbored resentment toward themselves, they unleashed it upon you. It was never about you. It was perpetually about what they could not face within themselves. They could not acknowledge that they embodied the toxicity. So they required someone gentler, someone kinder, someone who would not retaliate, and that was you. They depended upon your silence. They relied upon your compassion. They weaponized your empathy against you. And the greater the anguish they projected onto you, the lighter they felt. Yet you bore it all, oblivious to why you perpetually felt depleted, anxious, or guilty for burdens that were not yours to carry. What they enacted was not merely unjust. It constituted emotional and spiritual abuse. They did not simply treat you like a refuse container. They treated your soul as though it were disposable. And now that people are awakening to what truly transpired, it is beginning to appear grotesque. Because the very ones who performed victimhood are being revealed for their authentic nature. Manipulators who deposited their rot onto someone too pure to fling it back. You were never the affliction. You were the reflection, and they shattered it because they could not endure witnessing themselves. Point 4. Your innocence was not merely misunderstood. It was deliberately targeted. They were not speculating. They were not mistaken. They knew precisely who you were. They observed the manner in which you moved with quiet fortitude, with integrity that did not yield, with a spirit that did not recoil beneath pressure, and that is what triggered them. It was not ignorance. It was intent. They were not confused regarding your character. They were offended by it. Your innocence, your honesty, your refusal to engage in underhanded tactics made them feel exposed. So they rendered you a target, not because you committed any transgression, but because you refused to become like them. They could not control you, and that is what rendered you perilous in their perception. You were not propelled by fear or validation or approval. You did not flatter egos or diminish yourself to preserve harmony. You did not fabricate friendships or pursue recognition. That brand of freedom unnerves individuals who depend upon manipulation to sustain authority. Your authenticity disturbed their illusion of authority, the one wherein they determined who ascended and who descended, who was embraced and who was rejected, who received affection and who was abandoned. Yet you did not require their framework. You did not engage in their contest, and they despised you for it. So they did not simply misunderstand you, they pursued you. They prodded, provoked, and plotted. They twisted your words, weaponized your kindness, and attempted to convert your strength into weakness. Because if they could damage your reputation, they could reclaim the control they forfeited the instant you refused to yield. It was never about what you did. It was about what you did not do. You did not conform. You did not participate in the falsehoods. You did not permit their tactics to mold you, and that rendered you untouchable, at least spiritually. Yet here is the twisted element. They respected your radiance just enough to fear it, but not enough to safeguard it. Rather than honoring what was exceptional within you, they attempted to obliterate it. They did not desire others to perceive what they perceived, because if others recognized your truth, the entire counterfeit empire they constructed would crumble. You were not assaulted because you were flawed. You were assaulted because you were genuine. And within a world saturated with individuals concealing themselves behind facades, authenticity constitutes the most formidable threat imaginable. Point 5. They required you to be guilty. Because if you are innocent, they are monsters. They required you to be guilty, even if they had to distort the narrative to accomplish it. Because if you were innocent, verifiably and undeniably innocent, then everything they perpetrated against you becomes indefensible. Every falsehood, every setup, every smear, every betrayal, it all transforms into evidence that they were not merely mistaken, they were cruel, and their egos could not endure that reality. So rather than confronting their own darkness, they manufactured a version of reality wherein your anguish was warranted. They had to. Otherwise they would be compelled to perceive themselves for what they truly are. It was not about facts. It was not about logic. It was about narrative control. You were a complication they preferred not to resolve. You were a truth they wished to expunge. And the most expedient method to expunge someone is to rewrite their character. So they transformed your boundaries into disrespect, your silence into guilt, your detachment into arrogance. They crafted a narrative wherein you were the villain and they were merely the unfortunate souls attempting to cope with your alleged conduct. It was a performance, yet worse than that, it was strategic. They donned their most convincing victim masks while quietly stabbing you in chambers you were not permitted to enter. They wept about how wounded they were, precisely loud enough to drown out the evidence. Because if people ever examined more closely, if anyone ever posed authentic questions, the mask would descend, and beneath it, pure calculation, envy, control, insecurity. Yet they could not afford that exposure. So you had to accept the fall. You had to become the villain so they could continue wearing halos they never earned. That is the variety of evil that conceals itself behind charm and concern. It does not shriek, it whispers. It does not push, it manipulates. And it deploys every resource at its disposal to evade accountability, because accountability would necessitate acknowledging you were the target, not the threat. And that reality would demolish the image they have labored so diligently to preserve. You were not a villain. You were a mirror, and they could not endure what they witnessed. So they painted you black merely to feel white again. Yet now the paint is deteriorating. And the truth, it is thunderous. Point 6. You constituted a menace to their hierarchy of hypocrisy. You were an inconvenience for them the moment you declined to abide by their regulations, not because you were aggressive, not because you were disrespectful, but because you were authentic. You traversed into their meticulously constructed system of artificiality and did not bow. You made no attempt to impress anyone. You did not participate in their power struggles. You did not flatter egos, pursue validation, or maintain silence merely to preserve your position at the table. That rendered you dangerous because individuals like you expose everything counterfeit without conscious effort. Their entire architecture was constructed upon pretense, status above substance, image above integrity. It revolved around whom you knew, how proficiently you performed, and how greatly you were prepared to sacrifice your truth for acceptance. And then you materialized, not requesting permission, not pleading for inclusion, and still radiating. That disrupted everything because you were not intended to stand tall unless they granted you authorization. You were not intended to speak unless they endorsed your voice. Yet you spoke. You stood. You navigated through their ranks armed with nothing but authenticity, and it destabilized them. They concealed themselves behind titles, positions, manufactured smiles, and mutual secrets. Yet you required none of that. You did not gossip to advance. You did not lie to conform. You did not behave one way publicly and another behind closed doors. And that terrified them. Because an individual who cannot be bribed, purchased, bullied, or broken constitutes a grave threat to a system constructed upon fear and manipulation. You were not intended to be bold. You were not intended to be free. You were not intended to be you, not absent their approval. And when they recognized they could not control you, they endeavored to label you as overly difficult, overly intense, overly truthful. Yet none of it adhered, because you were never interested in conforming. You were excessively focused on standing firm. And that is what they could not manage. You did not threaten their safety. You threatened their falsehoods. You did not attempt to demolish their world. Your truth simply exposed how hollow it truly was. You did not challenge their position. Your presence challenged their foundation. And once people commenced observing the distinction between authentic and counterfeit, the entire structure began trembling. Point 7. They deployed collective gaslighting to transmute sanity into suspicion. They could not dismantle you individually, so they mobilized a multitude. That is how collective gaslighting operates. It is not merely a single individual twisting the truth. It is an entire network propagating the same lie until it commences sounding credible. They did not simply desire to bewilder you. They desired to bewilder everyone because as long as people questioned you, they would not question them. That was the objective. Invert the script so thoroughly that the innocent appeared guilty and the guilty departed unscathed. They initiated with subtle jabs, minor comments, understated shade. Do you not think they are excessively pleasant? There is simply something about them I cannot precisely identify. I am uncertain. Something feels amiss. These declarations were not grounded in facts. They were planted to cultivate suspicion, and the more they reiterated them, the more people commenced wondering whether perhaps it was accurate, because when sufficient people whisper the identical doubt, it commences reverberating like a fact. Your kindness became a tactic. Your honesty was reframed as aggression. Your silence, which represented your effort to safeguard your tranquility, became the evidence they employed to portray you as frigid or culpable. They inverted everything admirable about you into a weapon against you. That is how manipulation conceals itself in plain sight. They possessed no proof, but they possessed volume. They possessed no integrity, but they possessed numbers. And people frequently believe the loudest voices, not the most truthful ones. You commenced feeling as though you existed within a realm where nothing aligned, where the more honest you were, the more you were doubted, where regardless of what you articulated, it could be distorted. That is not paranoia. That is psychological warfare. That is what transpires when individuals collaborate to rewrite your reality. Not because you are unstable, but because your stability threatened theirs. And the most extraordinary element is that none of it was accidental. It was orchestrated. It was sustained. It was rehearsed. Because if people ever perceived you clearly, if they genuinely attended to your character, your consistency, your spirit, the entire web of falsehoods would collapse. And deep within they recognized it. So they endeavored to do everything within their power, to blur the vision, to muddy the waters, and to cause you to doubt the very radiance you carry. Point 8. Your presence threatened the entire system of falsehoods they inhabited. You did not enter seeking conflict. You were merely being yourself. Yet your presence alone destabilized everything they presumed was secure, not because you were loud or aggressive, but because you were truthful within a space constructed upon lies. You did not even need to speak for the majority of the time. Simply existing, holding your ground, standing within your own integrity, rendered people uncomfortable. And not merely slightly, it unsettled them fundamentally because the truth you carried caused their counterfeit reality to commence fracturing. They had constructed an entire system predicated upon image, manipulation, and secrets. Years of pretense, years of projecting the role without embodying it, years of backdoor arrangements, silent betrayals, and unspoken pacts to safeguard the illusion. And then you appeared unbothered, unbought, and unwilling to bow. That constituted a threat, not to their physical safety, but to the psychological fortress they had constructed to conceal themselves from their own emptiness. You did not follow their script. You did not worship their titles. You did not laugh at their manufactured jokes or sit silently when something was amiss. You lived by truth, and that proved excessive, because truth exposes everything, particularly the components people labored most strenuously to conceal. You did not need to accuse anyone. Your mere presence sufficed to reveal what was incongruent. And rather than becoming inspired to evolve, they panicked, so they endeavored to silence you, not through open confrontation, but through labels. They branded you as difficult, arrogant, rebellious, antisocial, anything that would discredit you without necessitating engagement with what you actually represented. Because if people attended to you, if they perceived what you perceived, if they awakened as you had, the entire system would collapse. The falsehoods would forfeit their power, the fear would relinquish its grip, the control would dissolve, and they could not afford that. You were not merely an outsider. You were a collapse awaiting manifestation. They observed it, they sensed it, and rather than changing, they elected to attack, because when someone carries truth of that magnitude, it does not merely render people uncomfortable. It causes everything constructed upon falsehood to commence trembling. And that is precisely what you accomplished. You were the transformation they could not impede. Point 9. They mistreated you publicly, then asserted that you humiliated them. They transformed your suffering into a spectacle, and then possessed the audacity to behave as though you were the one who transgressed boundaries. They humiliated you through both overt and subtle methods, mocking you before others, disrespecting you behind your back, distorting your words, and stripping you of your dignity, all while ensuring there were witnesses. And when you finally responded, when your anguish surfaced, when your silence transformed into distance, or your tears into boundaries, they inverted the narrative and proclaimed you were the one generating a scene. That is how corrupted it had become. They abused you, then pivoted and labeled you dramatic. They shamed you, then accused you of excessive sensitivity. They disrespected you, then informed people you were the one who lacked respect. It was a masterclass in deflection. They would harm you, and then feign offense that you exhibited any emotion. Your bleeding proved more embarrassing to them than the reality that they had wounded you in the first place. They were never concerned regarding how they made you feel. They were solely concerned regarding how you made them appear, because the moment your truth commenced, seeping through in your body language, in your tone, in the manner you withdrew, it threatened their image. So they needed to act expeditiously. Damage control, reputation management, and the most expedient method to accomplish that was to fault you for reacting to the anguish they generated. And here is where it becomes even more grotesque. They did not merely believe their own falsehoods, they persuaded other people to believe them as well. People who never witnessed the complete narrative, people who lacked the context, people who observed only your reaction, not the years of disrespect that precipitated it. They ensured the audience perceived a version of you that appeared unstable, bitter or malicious, all while they performed calm, concerned, and perplexed. It was manipulation at its pinnacle. You did not humiliate them. You exposed them, and they could not manage it. So they endeavored to invert the blame before anyone deciphered the truth. They were not the victims. They were the performers in a cruel, calculated spectacle. And you were the one who finally ceased applauding. Point 10. You constituted the living evidence that goodness persists, and that was intolerable. You did not need to preach, prove, or propel anything. Simply by being who you are, you disrupted their entire worldview. You were the living testimony that virtuous people still exist, and that destabilized them because for years they had constructed their identity around the conviction that everyone is fake, selfish, and self-serving. That conviction justified how they treated people. It rendered it simpler to live without remorse. Yet you were the exception they could not disregard. You embodied everything they had forsaken. While they discussed loyalty as though it were weakness, you lived it as a code. You did not abandon people the instant circumstances grew difficult. You did not pursue shortcuts or switch allegiances to gain favor. You showed up. You remained genuine. You did not merely articulate the appropriate sentiments, you enacted them even when no one was observing. And that rendered them uncomfortable because it compelled them to perceive how far they had descended from who they pretended to be. They did not desire a reminder. They desired an excuse. They required the world to be dark so they could feel justified in their darkness. They required believing that kindness was perpetually fake, that honesty was perpetually manipulation, that love was perpetually transactional because that is how they operated. And then you arrived. And without conscious effort, you exposed their entire facade. You did not exploit people, you protected them, you did not gossip. You shielded others even when they did not merit it. You did not pursue vengeance. You departed with your dignity intact. Your existence was not merely different. It was convicting. It reminded them that they possessed a choice and they selected cruelty. They selected pettiness. They selected bitterness. You did not render them cruel. You rendered it more difficult for them to pretend they were not. You did not align with their narrative, so they endeavored to demolish yours. Because if someone like you can navigate everything you have navigated and still maintain a pure heart, then what is their justification? If you can traverse fire and not grow cold, then what does that convey about those who grew bitter over substantially less? You were the evidence they preferred not to perceive. That goodness persists, that love remains authentic, and that the affliction was not life, it was them. Point 11, their assault was not merely physical or emotional. It constituted spiritual treason. What they enacted against you was not simply cruel, it was spiritually reckless. They did not merely cross a boundary with a human being, they trespassed upon something sacred. Your life is not ordinary, whether they comprehended it or not. There exists a divine assignment upon you, a purpose, a calling, a radiance you carry that is not self-originated but God-bestowed. And when they attacked you, they were not merely attacking an individual. They were challenging something vastly greater. They were violating something holy. Some individuals believe they are merely being petty. They believe their jealousy, gossip, and betrayal constitute normal life. Yet when you are chosen, when you are walking in alignment with a higher plan, those actions carry profound significance. Their words were not merely unkind. They were declarations spoken against something anointed. Their schemes were not merely personal. They were acts of rebellion against divine order. Whether they intended to or not, they entered a conflict for which they were unqualified, and the consequences they do not control them. It was not merely emotional damage, it was spiritual treason. They mocked what they failed to understand. They touched what they were not authorized to touch. You were not merely another person they could dismantle and abandon. You were connected to something sacred, something eternal. And when individuals lay hands physically, verbally, or spiritually upon someone who has been set apart by God, they trigger a response that exists beyond human control. It may not arrive immediately, yet it always arrives. That is why some of them are currently confronting losses they cannot explain. Sealed doors they believed were wide open, restless nights, peculiar disruptions within their lives, because they believed they were merely targeting you. They failed to recognize they were entering a spiritual covenant they never examined. They came against someone innocent, oblivious that heaven had already inscribed your name. And when you harm the innocent with malice, with intention, with pleasure, there exists a cost. Not because you wished it upon them, but because universal law does not permit that to remain unpaid. They believed they were evading consequences. Yet spiritual consequences require no cameras or courts. They operate in silence and they are invariably punctual. Point 12. You were adjudicated within the tribunal of cowards, denied any opportunity to defend yourself. You never received a chance to speak. The verdict was predetermined before you even realized you were being judged. You were assessed by individuals who never possessed the courage to inquire directly, who never granted you the dignity of dialogue. Instead, they relied upon whispers, side comments, assumptions, and hearsay. And once the narrative accumulated momentum, it was no longer about veracity. It was about utility. They did not desire clarity. They desired a conclusion that rendered them comfortable, even if it meant bearing false witness against your name. They treated rumors as facts and silence as guilt. The very individuals who claimed to value truth did not wish to hear yours because the moment you commenced articulating your perspective, they would be compelled to confront the possibility that they were mistaken. And for many among them, acknowledging that would inflict greater pain than embracing a falsehood. So they excluded you. They sustained the dialogue without you, like spectators within a tribunal where you stood as the accused. And the entire jury consisted of cowards. You were surrounded by individuals who lacked the spine to stand alone in truth, so they concealed themselves behind the security of the crowd. They employed manufactured neutrality as a cover for betrayal. They articulated phrases like, "I prefer not to take sides," while passively permitting your name to be torn apart. They observed your character being dissected by individuals who never even attempted to comprehend it, and they uttered nothing. Silence became endorsement. Distance became alignment, and throughout it all you were left standing in the center of a tempest you never generated. The most reprehensible element is that they expected you to swallow it, to accept it as a lesson, to remain humble, to forgive swiftly so they could evade accountability. Yet what they failed to recognize is that every falsehood they uttered, every dialogue they conducted behind your back, every occasion they permitted your name to be dragged through the mud, it was recorded. Perhaps not by cameras, but by the divine. They believed you were finished. They believed the narrative was closed. Yet truth possesses a peculiar capacity for survival. It may advance slowly, yet it advances with purpose. And now, while their version of events is disintegrating, your truth remains standing, quiet, solid, unshaken. Because when you are innocent, time invariably testifies upon your behalf. Point 13. They did not desire justice. They desired blood that would not stain their hands. They never sought fairness. They never sought understanding. What they sought was destruction, yet without bearing the guilt of delivering it directly. So they operated within shadows. They stirred the pot, then retreated and observed it boil over. Feigning they had nothing to do with the chaos, they whispered just sufficiently to transform people against you, yet maintained sufficient distance that no one could trace it back to them. That was the game. They desired your downfall, yet they did not wish to appear as though they had pushed you. They did not throw punches. They merely distributed the weapons. They permitted others to speak on their behalf, fight their conflicts, and soil their hands, while they reclined appearing composed and concerned. They employed gossip as a form of warfare. They disseminated doubt in strategic locations, planted suspicion in fragile minds, and permitted the remainder to execute the work for them. If anyone confronted them, they performed innocence. I was merely concerned. I am only stating this because I care, yet beneath those saccharine utterances lay malice adorned with a smile. They were not seeking justice. Justice would necessitate honesty, accountability, and truth. Elements they were never prepared to confront. They were not interested in resolution. They desired to observe you suffer. They desired to observe you isolated, misunderstood, and stripped of everything that rendered you feeling safe and seen. And when life struck you severely, whether emotionally, financially, spiritually, or mentally, they offered no genuine support. They celebrated in silence. They exchanged knowing glances in secret, because within their minds, your anguish confirmed the narrative they had been peddling throughout. And yet, they still desired to appear as decent people. That was the most repugnant element. They desired your blood upon the ground, without a single blemish upon their hands. So they laundered their image while your name became dragged. They hurled stones and concealed themselves behind smiles. And while others believed they were maintaining neutrality or demonstrating maturity, they were actually orchestrating your downfall from a distance. Yet the truth is commencing to surface. People are beginning to pose questions, and those who celebrated your anguish in silence are now terrified because they recognize what is approaching. You may have bled, yet you did not break, and the same individuals who endeavored to destroy you without becoming tainted are about to be exposed completely for who they have been all along. Point 14. Their hands are now stained with the guilt of having touched God's anointed. There exists a distinction between harming merely anyone and harming someone possessing divine protection. They did not merely come for you. They touched something sacred, something set apart. They failed to recognize that when they attacked you, they were prodding at a force vastly greater than yourself, because you were not navigating life alone. You were moving beneath divine assignment. And when someone endeavors to tear down what God has appointed, they are not merely perpetrating cruelty. They are perpetrating spiritual treason. They believed it was merely gossip, merely a rumor, merely a few innocuous jabs. They believed your breakdowns were amusing. Your tears represented weakness. Your silence signified defeat. Yet every occasion they mocked your anguish or disregarded your cries, they were not merely accumulating cruelty. They were composing their own sentence. Because there exists a divine order to things, and it invariably balances. They may have delayed your justice, yet they could never cancel it. They desired the world to perceive you as a failure. Instead, the world is commencing to perceive them for what they are. Manipulators concealed behind masks, cowards dressed in costumes of concern. They hope to bury you within silence, yet their schemes are now echoing so loudly that even the deaf can perceive them. Truth invariably outlives falsehood. And now truth is erupting like a volcano that has been simmering beneath pressure for too long. And here is the reality. Whether they confess or not, whether they ever apologize or not, karma awaits no apology from them. It is already in motion. The law of sowing and reaping accepts no bribes. Every word, every act of betrayal, every distortion of truth they wielded against you, it is recorded. And the divine overlooks no detail. So while they pretend to maintain control, their own lives are unraveling. Their own tranquility is evaporating. They are haunted not by you, but by the truth they endeavored to bury. Because once you harm someone who was dispatched by God, someone innocent, pure-hearted, and walking in obedience, you do not merely face consequences from people. You answer to heaven. Their hands are stained. Their masks are fracturing. And the same individuals who once observed you suffer are now observing in disbelief as the tables turn. You may not have obtained justice within their system, yet heaven has already ruled in your favor, and that verdict is irreversible. What they enacted against you was never merely petty. It constituted a calculated, soul-deep assault upon someone who walked with divine purpose. They endeavored to rewrite your narrative with falsehoods, smear your character with projection, and bury your innocence beneath a mountain of manipulation, all to safeguard the fragile illusions they constructed their lives upon. Yet no falsehood endures eternally, and no weapon formed against truth can outpace its consequences. They did not merely offend you, they offended what you carry. They touched sacred ground with tainted hands, and now they are reaping what they sowed. Not because you sought vengeance, but because the universe possesses eyes, and God does not slumber. The same mouths that falsely accused you are now stammering beneath the weight of exposure. The same hands that endeavored to tear you down are now trembling from the fallout of divine justice. You were not deranged. You were not the villain. You were the light within a room saturated with cowards who preferred the darkness. And now, one by one, their illusions are collapsing. The masks have been removed, the tables are turning, and the very individuals who once applauded your downfall are now choking upon their silence. Allow them to observe, allow them to whisper, allow them to squirm, because you never needed to fight dishonestly to prevail. You held your ground, remained faithful to yourself, and permitted truth to fulfill what it invariably accomplishes. Rise. If this message stirred something profound within you, do not merely sit with it, stand with it. Your story, your truth, and your voice matter more than ever. So let us construct a sanctuary where the authentic ones ascend and the masks descend. Subscribe to the channel. This transcends mere content. It constitutes a movement. Like the video if you felt seen, heard, or empowered. Comment below. Your narrative could represent the breakthrough someone else requires. Share this with someone who has been silenced, doubted, or betrayed. They require hearing this. Truth-tellers, light carriers, and chosen souls, this space belongs to you. Let us maintain the flame ignited. God bless you.